Okay, I've just checked the assignments on page 115. Now let's talk about your answers together. Number one, who was, or I'm sorry, what was a Hessian? Grady.
German mercenaries.
Right. And what's a mercenary?
I knew that was gonna happen. Isn't it someone who like kills for money or something like that?
That might sound like a hired assassin.
Oh.
But yeah, you're sort of correct. Can somebody give me a more precise definition, Nate?
A soldier for hire.
A soldier for hire. Yeah.
No.
Now, I once went to a no.
No, it's a person that filled out the ranks of the British forces in America. Mine is more scientific, so.
Yeah, but it doesn't indicate that they were soldiers that were hired from another country. Technically, according to some people at a reenactment that I went to one time, the Hessians were not mercenaries. Because a soldier for hire is usually individuals that hire themselves out as soldiers. Whereas in this case, these soldiers were part of an army from the region of Hesse in Germany, and they had no choice. They weren't hiring themselves out to the British. Their prince hired them out to the British. He was a relative of the King of England, who was German, and so he hired these people. So technically, they're not mercenary, but that's usually the term that's used to indicate the what kind of soldiers these were. They were really soldiers from Germany and were hired as a whole, or their prince was paid in order to use his army. Okay, so that is the more exact definition of who they were. Second question, why did the Continental Congress choose George Washington as commander-in-chief? And I said you should indicate 2 reasons. Give me 1 reason, Alex.
He had a great commanding presence.
Right? Give me another reason, Megan. Hermie? All right, he had demonstrated his ability to be cool under fire. What situation had he been in that demonstrated that? Devin?
The French and Indian War.
Right. Okay, another reason.
His keen ability to lead and inspire.
Okay, so he had leadership abilities. So a lot of that it goes back to his experience. We could kind of summarize much of what you said under the rubric of his previous experience. Is there anything else about him that made him an ideal candidate? Stephen?
He would help link the Patriot cause with the rest of the country.
How? How would he do that?
Um,
Why him?
People.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, no.
No.
I've been to his house, so don't try me. I'm bored.
What is that? Yes. How many had he as a Southerner? That was a key part of why they chose him. And it relates to what Stephen was trying to say. That because he was a Southerner, well, how would that link the colonies together? Where had most of the action taken place thus far?
Middle.
Stephen, if you don't know what you're talking about, don't say anything. Most of it taken place around Boston, right? So what if they appointed a general from Boston area? The rest of the colonies would say, yeah, that's their problem, who cares? But if we've got a Southerner in charge, that links everybody together more. All right, we'll talk more about that later, probably. Number 3, who helped break the deadlock of Boston by bringing in artillery? Who was that? Hayden.
Henry Knox.
Right, Colonel Henry Knox. And from where did he get this artillery? Caleb.
Fort Ticonderoga.
Right. Now remember those 2 things. Those are important facts. And number 4, who was largely responsible for the original draft of the Declaration of Independence? We're looking for one person here. Lydia?
Thomas Jefferson.
Right, Thomas Jefferson. He had help, as we will talk about later as well. Haley, make sure you show me your work before you leave. All right, now let's get into your notes, looking at the section called Declaring Independence. The first thing we want to do is what you do anytime you have two sides that are going to be fighting each other. You try to determine who's going to win. We do this every week in football season, right? Sometimes people watch pre-game shows for hours when they're doing nothing but talking about who they think is going to win and why. So we do this all the time. Well, looking at the two sides that are going to be fighting in this struggle, we want to determine what are the strengths and weaknesses of these two sides and who can we expect to win. All right, so you have a section in your notes, I think, that you can put these things. First of all, we want to look at the British advantages. So the British versus America. All right, in the area of population, the British have the advantage. Notice they have 7.5 million people versus 2.5 million people in America. So you're drawing on a much larger population. Secondly, in monetary wealth, the British had the advantage. Don't have figures here, but you just know that England was a wealthy nation, comparatively speaking. America, a lot of frontiersmen. There was some wealth too, but not near what the British had. The third area in which the British had advantage was naval power. The British had the strongest navy in the world at the time. Remember, after the Spanish Armada went to defeat Great Britain's navy was what became the replacement then, the navy that was stronger than any, certainly in Europe and maybe the world. What kind of navy did the American side have? What's that, Jesse? None. So any navy would be stronger than the American Navy, and just so happens the British Navy is number one. So that's a huge advantage, right, for the British. All right, what about the professional army? What kind of professional army does America have? None. What does the British Army have? They have 50,000 men, that's in America, plus they have 30,000 Hessians. And this is something that a lot of people either ignore or are not aware of, and that there were 50,000 loyalists. These are 50,000 Americans that fought on the side of the British. There are as many Americans fighting on the side of the British as there are British soldiers. And the British got the Indians to fight on their side too, and we don't know how many there were of them. They never took account. All right. Next area, we're looking at America, which is an advantage for the British, is that the Americans were badly organized and lacking in unity. That's nothing new, is it? We saw that they've been lacking in unity all along. But they have no central government. They have a bunch of different colonies, each are used to doing what they want to do. Now, you look at this and you say, how in the world could the Americans expect to be able to defeat such a foe? Add that to the fact that in America there was not only disunity, but there was jealousy between the different colonies, between different people in the colonies. In America there were economic difficulties. In order to have any money to pay for a war, they had to print paper money. But paper money is only as good as the gold that backs it up, or the silver that backs it up. So that if you have paper money, you can go to a bank and say, I would like gold for this, I would like silver for this, and they would pay you. Now, when I was a kid, you used to be able to do that. On the bills, it said that it was a silver certificate. Pay to the bearer $5 in silver, whatever. It was a $5 bill. And you could go to the bank, give them a $5 bill, they would give you $5 worth of silver coins. Can't do that anymore because our money is no longer backed by anything but the good name of our government. Doesn't that give you confidence?
Yeah.
And even our silver coins are no longer silver, at least not totally. And so, you know, we've gone down the road of devaluing our money in a lot of ways. Well, what did the American colonists have? Well, they had paper money, but they didn't have any gold or silver backing it. That wasn't worth anything. And so anytime you've got paper money, you're printing money, that leads to inflation. So prices go up because the money is not worth as much. There is also in America a shortage of supplies, military supplies. In fact, much of the military supplies that America would use would be captured from the British or taken from the local munitions warehouse. There are little, if any, manufactured goods in America. There are few manufactured goods because Americans were part of what's called the mercantile system, where the British had the idea that we'll get raw materials from our colonies and we'll manufacture goods and then we'll sell those to our colonies. And that was kind of how the system worked. So factories were not necessary in America because you could always buy it from Britain. And then the militias were not always reliable. Now we've talked about how in certain instances when the call went out, the Minutemen came, you know, Boston, they showed up. But you couldn't always depend on that. You know, you could give out the call and maybe not everybody would come. Maybe people were working on their farm and say, this is more important. And just because they responded to Boston doesn't mean in other parts of the colonies that they would respond the same way. Plus, you didn't even know how they would act when they got there. And then 10th, there were American profiteers. Do you know what a profiteer is? Or can you guess? What is a profiteer? Well, what in that word do you know? Profit. So if you're a profiteer, what are you probably doing? Making a profit. So Americans are interested in making profit. Who isn't? So what is a profiteer in this case, do you think, that turns out to be a disadvantage for Americans in this war? What are Americans doing?
Maybe it's someone who doesn't really care which way the war goes. They just want to make money off of it.
Yeah. And so if anything from a farmer to a merchant, if you want to get real money for your product, are you going to sell it to American colonists or are you going to sell it to the British? The British, because they have real money. And we'll see that come into play later on. Okay, so here are a lot of advantages that the British have. So do the Americans not have any advantages at all? Do they have any strengths? No. You might think that that's pretty much exhausted it all. But if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Because there are some strengths. Yes, I know, Stephen, it seems surprising. But there are some American advantages. Let's see what they are. First of all, the British had trouble at home. America wasn't the only place where they had some difficulty. Ireland also was creating problems for Great Britain. Ireland has been a problem for Great Britain for many, many years. And they were at this time. They also had the prospect of France always hanging around, just waiting for a chance to do something against Great Britain. Why? Why would France like a chance to do something that would be against Great Britain? Anything happened in recent history that might lead them to have that attitude? Lydia, anything happened? Oh, the French and Indian War. Yeah, who won that war? Yeah, the British. Took away a lot of territory from France. So France is looking for an opportunity to do something against Great Britain, take them down off their high horse. In addition to that, the British government at the time was confused and inept. The people that were in charge of Parliament basically were incompetent much of the time. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't seem to know what direction to head. In addition to that, there was an opposing political party in Parliament, and that's the Whig Party. The Whigs were against what Parliament was doing. All right, so at home, the British government had a lot of difficulties. Ireland, France is always waiting. People were confused, inept in the government, and the opposition to the Whig Party. All right, any questions about any of that? All right, next there was the discouragement of the British troops. First of all, even though William Pitt had replaced the generals during the French and Indian War, the generals that now were commanding the forces in America were second rate. These were not the best generals. Secondly, the soldiers were treated brutally. That is somewhat the result of the generals not being very good. The soldiers were not treated well. Now, in a lot of times during war, if soldiers are in a foreign place and are not treated well, they really have no recourse. But in America, among people speaking the same language, of essentially the same culture, what recourse do soldiers in the British Army have if they're being treated badly?
Switch sides.
They can leave. Just walk away, blend into the population because they could, because they didn't look different than the citizens of the colonies. You know, get some new clothing, you speak the same language, and that's what, you know, a number of soldiers did. They deserted. They could. But many of them were treated badly, which doesn't help them when they're going out to fight. Yeah, let's fight for that general who doesn't know what he's doing and who beats us. You know, that's not really a good rallying cry, is it? They had inadequate provisions. Remember we talked about how the Boston Port Act not only kept supplies from coming into Boston for the citizens, but also for the soldiers. They weren't able to get supplies either. In fact, in some cases, I've read the British soldiers were eating. This is what they were given for their meals: captured biscuits from the French and Indian War. So these are biscuits that have been baked by the French. French biscuits. That sounds good. Yes, but it's from a war that had happened, you know, a decade before. What kind of shape would those biscuits be? Hmm? Disgusting. What would they be like, you think?
Hard.
Hard. Have you ever tried to eat hard bread? Hard biscuit? You got to soften it up a little. You got to do something, right? Well, some of these biscuits were so hard that some of the British soldiers actually put them in the cannon to fire. They figured that was just as hard as a cannonball. All right, so inadequate provisions was an advantage for Americans. Next, the British had to win. A draw would be a loss. Explain that. Why did the British have to win? Why could they not fight to no decision? And conversely, the Americans could fight to a no decision. Michaela?
Because if they had a draw, you would go with America, and so they would go.
If they fought to a draw, what would change?
Nothing.
Nothing. There'd still be a problem. So the British had to win. If they wanted the American colonists to be subservient to the British Parliament, they had to be defeated. You see? The British couldn't fight just to fight the battles. They had to win. If they didn't win, then it really would be a loss. Next, the distance. The British were at a disadvantage in that they were fighting at a great distance from home. That's not just talking about being homesick, but the British generals were being micromanaged at times by Parliament. Well, it takes a while for messages to get from Parliament over to America. And oftentimes, by the time the message from Parliament got to a general, it really didn't apply anymore. The situation had changed. So they were forced to try to follow orders that didn't really even make sense. So the distance provided a problem, as well as getting supplies, things like that. The next advantage for the Americans was the geographical expanse of America. Now, European nations were used to fighting wars which were contained in relatively small areas. Let's take a look at the map and you get an idea. So we have Great Britain here. You know, they fought wars in Europe before. They would again. You know, France here. These other nations here. They're used to fighting in rather small areas. But now the British are coming over here to America, and the amount of area that they've got to cover has increased tremendously from what they're used to. So they can't just go to one city, you know, the main city, and defeat that, and then say, okay, we defeated the country. Doesn't work that way in America, because there are a number of important cities. There is a wide expanse of territory. And what we're going to see later on is that when the British take Philadelphia, they think, okay, that's it, we won. But the government of the United States, which was meeting in Philadelphia, just moved out into one of the towns outside of Philadelphia. So, and Washington's army, it keeps moving. So they can't defeat the enemy because the enemy can spread out. They're all over the place. It's a large geographical area. Lastly, the Americans had outstanding leadership. As we go through this war, you're going to see a number of times where American leadership comes to the forefront. The American leaders do a good job. Not necessarily right away. We're going to see Washington. He's going to have some growing pains. But eventually, he's going to figure it out. And he's going to be a good leader. Next, the availability of foreign aid is going to help the Americans. In fact, without foreign aid, we wouldn't have won. Oh, I hope I didn't spoil the ending for you. We do win in the end. Spoiler alert, sorry. And we could have done it without France. France helped us. So we have foreign aid coming in. Next, there's some European officers that come over and help us. Just to basically show up in America and say, hey, I like what you're doing. I'd like to help. And we'll talk about some of those as we go along. Then there's also the principle of a defensive fight. You know, you think about it this way. If you're fighting a battle to preserve your own home versus fighting a battle against someone who is trying to protect his own home, who ostensibly would fight harder? I mean, you could say that anybody's going to fight hard in a battle, but you've got more at stake. You're going to fight harder. And so the Americans have more at stake. They're fighting for their own homes, their own families, their own livelihood. So they care a lot more about what happens, right? The Americans were more self-sustaining. You know, it would appear at least that the Americans would be able to get supplies from the local areas, you know, be able to get food and things like that. You know, many soldiers, you know, were fighting in an area not too far from their homes, so they would get supplies that way. So they were more self-sustaining. They didn't depend upon, many times, weren't depending upon some government official to get supplies to them. They would bring their own. They would find their own. Next, the Americans are tough and self-reliant. And this became characteristic of Americans in general, that Americans, because they're living in a rougher environment than maybe they had in Europe, they become tough. They become used to doing things on their own. They're used to making their own way. Nobody has a position in America because their father was important. If you have a position, it's because you work for it. So Americans are tough and self-reliant. This is something that is true of Americans for many, many years. Next, there was a moral advantage. That is, the Americans felt that they were fighting for a just cause. They weren't just fighting because their government told them to fight. They're fighting because they believe in what they're fighting for. They believe in the liberty that they hope to preserve or gain through this conflict. They felt that what they were doing was just. It was something that even God would bless, because what they were doing was right. And what the British were doing was wrong. It was illegal, in fact. All right, so those are the advantages and disadvantages. Now, as you look at the list and you consider how it all breaks apart, if you look at the British advantages, they're primarily the physical advantages of waging war. If you look at the American advantages, there's some physical advantages, but primarily you're looking at things that are maybe not so easily grabbed. Something you can grab a hold of. They are more emotional, spiritual, character kind of advantages. And we'll see which one ends up winning out. All right, next let's consider divided loyalties. First of all, in the colonies, there are three groups of people essentially in the colonies, divided according to their belief. First, there are the patriots, who are the ones fighting for the cause of liberty. We'll call them patriots. There are other names we could give them as well, but when we talk about the patriots, we're referring to those that believe in separation from England, believe in fighting for their liberty. Secondly, there are the loyalists, sometimes called Tories, who supported the king, who said, no, we need to follow what the king says. He is our king, and so we need to obey him. We need to obey the government that's over us. Those are the loyalists. And then there were a number of people who were just uncommitted. They basically were waiting to see how it turns out. Didn't really feel strongly one way or another. Now, some have said that it was pretty much evenly divided between the three. I don't think that's the case. I think there were more patriots than there were loyalists. But there were very many people that were simply uncommitted, who didn't care which way it went, and just were waiting to see. All right, do you have any questions about the different groups of people representing the colonies? By the way, among the loyalists, some of them were so persecuted by patriots that they left. 100,000 loyalists actually left America over this. Many of them went up to Canada. Some of them went back to England. Back in the sense of that's maybe where their ancestors came from. So quite a few loyalists departed. Any questions? All right, next let's look at Britain. There was division there too. In fact, the hiring of Hessians came about because of the difficulty in raising armies from Englishmen. So as the government was trying to recruit soldiers to be in their army, it was difficult to convince people in England to join the army to fight against fellow Englishmen. You join the army, fight against your distant relatives. Yeah, that's great. I'm behind that. No. So they had a hard time getting people to join up for that cause. And so that left them then with hiring the Hessians to fight for them. Secondly, there was opposition in the government of England. The opposition, the Whig Party, was led by three primary people: William Pitt the Younger, Edmund Burke, and Charles James Fox. Edmund Burke is a man who wrote a lot about the principles of government. He's considered if not the father, at least a father of modern conservatism. That is, the ideas of liberty and limited government. Burke is the one who said, you've probably heard this quote, "All that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." You ever heard that? Well, William Pitt had something to say. He said, "You cannot conquer America, so stop trying." He was against the war. You cannot conquer America. And it was rather prescient that he said that. He understood better than the leaders of Parliament just what a huge task it would be to try to conquer America, for all the reasons that we just looked at. America was going to have their liberty, and the British were not going to be able to take that away from them. They were too used to it. They wanted to hang on to it. All right, any questions about the divided loyalties, both in the colonies and in Britain? All right, tomorrow we will begin looking at that Second Continental Congress. Remember when the First Continental Congress met, they said, if things don't get resolved, we'll come back again next year. Well, things don't get resolved. So they're going to be back. And we're going to find not only are they meeting and some important things come out of that, but we're also going to find some major battles that take place that are going to greatly influence what would happen in this conflict between the mother country of Great Britain and the teenage daughter country of the American colonies. So come back tomorrow.